If you ever find yourself alone at night in a place where the elderly reside, where time seems to have forgotten its passage, and where the silence is so profound that it presses against your eardrums like a vice, then perhaps you might begin to understand the dread that seeped into my bones during my first shift as the night caretaker at the Maple Oaks retirement home in Vermont. It wasn't just the creaking of the old wooden floors or the dim, flickering lights that cast elongated shadows down the narrow hallways. It was something else, something unseen, yet palpably present, lurking just beyond the edge of perception. They told me the job was simple: watch over the residents, ensure their safety, and report any incidents. But no one mentioned the rules. Not until I arrived for my first night shift and was handed a crumpled piece of paper with 7 handwritten directives, each more bizarre and unsettling than the last. I was told that adherence to these rules was not just recommended but essential for survival. And as I read them, a chill ran down my spine, for these were not guidelines for caregiving. They were warnings. The paper was yellowed and stained, the ink smudged in places as if by trembling hands. At the top, in bold, jagged letters, it read, 7 strange and terrifying rules to survive the night. I hesitated before reading further, but curiosity and a sense of foreboding compelled me to continue. Rule 1. Never acknowledge the whispers. If you hear your name being called from the dark corners of the hallway, ignore it. No matter how familiar the voice sounds, do not respond. It is not who you think it is. Rule 2. At exactly midnight, ensure that all the windows are closed and locked. If any window refuses to close, do not attempt to force it. Instead, vacate the room immediately and do not return until dawn. Rule 3. Avoid the mirror in room 217. If you must enter the room, keep your eyes averted from the mirror at all times. Should you accidentally glimpse your reflection and notice it smiling when you are not, leave the room without turning your back to the mirror. Rule 4. If you find a resident standing motionless in the hallway, do not approach them. Instead, announce your presence and wait. If they do not respond, retreat slowly and avoid eye contact. Rule 5. The elevator is not to be used between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. If the elevator arrives on your floor during this time without being called, do not enter. If the door is open and no one is inside, do not look in. Rule 6. Should you hear the sound of a music box playing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, locate its source immediately. If you find the music box, wind it up once and let it finish the tune. Failure to do so may result in the music playing endlessly, attracting unwanted attention. Rule 7. At 5 a.m., go to the main lobby and sit in the armchair facing the front door. Do not move until the sun rises. No matter what you see or hear, remain seated and do not respond to any stimuli. As I finished reading the last rule, a sense of unease settled over me. I looked up to find the head nurse, Margaret, watching me intently. Her eyes were tired and her voice was barely above a whisper as she said, "Follow the rules and you'll make it through the night." She handed me a flashlight and a set of keys before disappearing down the hallway, leaving me alone in the dimly lit reception area. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward midnight, each second amplifying the tension in the air. I decided to familiarize myself with the layout of the building, walking the corridors and noting the locations of each room. The residents were all asleep, their doors closed, and the only sounds were the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the old building settling. As the clock struck 12, I remembered Rule 2 and began checking the windows. Most closed without issue, but when I reached room 304, I found the window ajar. I attempted to close it, but it resisted, as if an unseen force held it open. Recalling the rule, I stepped back and left the room, closing the door behind me. A sudden gust of cold air brushed past me and I felt an inexplicable urge to run, but I forced myself to walk calmly back to the reception area. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. At around 2 a.m., I heard faint whispers echoing down the hallway. They called my name softly, pleadingly, in voices that sounded like my family and friends. My heart pounded and I clenched my fists, resisting the urge to respond. I remembered Rule 1 and remained silent, focusing on my breathing until the whispers faded into the silence. At 3:15 a.m., I stood near the elevator when the doors suddenly opened with a ding. No one was inside, and I hadn't pressed the button. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I took a step back, avoiding the temptation to look inside the elevator, and quickly walked away, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. As I passed room 217, I remembered Rule 3. Curiosity gnawed at me, but fear kept me from entering. I continued down the hallway, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, a soft melody filled the air, the unmistakable tune of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I followed the sound to the recreation room, where a small music box sat on a table, its lid open. I wound it once, and the music played to completion before stopping. The room fell silent again, and I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. As 5 a.m. approached, I made my way to the main lobby and sat in the designated armchair facing the front door. The darkness outside was impenetrable, and the silence inside was oppressive. I sat motionless, recalling Rule 7, and waited for the first light of dawn. The minutes crawled by, and I resisted the urge to look around, even when I heard faint footsteps behind me and felt a cold breath on my neck. I remained seated, unresponsive, until the sun's rays finally pierced through the windows, bathing the lobby in a warm glow. The oppressive atmosphere lifted and the building seemed to exhale, releasing the tension that had gripped it throughout the night. Margaret returned shortly after sunrise, her expression unreadable. "You made it," she said simply, taking the keys and flashlight from me. I nodded, too exhausted and overwhelmed to speak. As I left the building, the morning air felt fresh and invigorating, a stark contrast to the stifling dread of the night. I knew I would return for my next shift, but the memory of those 7 rules and the horrors they hinted at would haunt me forever. But as I climbed into my car and drove away from Maple Oaks, my hands still trembling slightly on the steering wheel and my eyes darting toward the rearview mirror without understanding why, there was a lingering feeling, one that burrowed beneath my skin and clung to the lining of my ribs like mold in damp corners. An awful, heavy realization that the horrors I had encountered that night were not just the result of overactive imagination or the suggestion of an eerie atmosphere, but something real, something old, and something watching. I barely slept that day, even though my body begged for rest with an ache in every muscle and a dull pounding in the back of my skull. Every time I began to drift off, I heard soft noises, faint clicking sounds from my kitchen, a whisper from the hallway outside my bedroom door, the hum of a tune I didn't recognize but somehow knew was not mine to hear. When my phone vibrated at 6 p.m. with a text from Margaret that simply read, "See you tonight," I felt my stomach knot so hard I thought I might vomit. Still, I replied with a half-hearted, "Yes, of course," as if trying to reassure both her and myself that I had the courage to return. I arrived just before 10 p.m., hoping that the extra time might allow me to gather myself before the madness began again. But the moment I stepped through the front doors of the building, that same thick, suffocating air enveloped me again, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever I had encountered the night before had never truly left. It had merely gone still, quiet, coiled in the shadows like a snake awaiting the return of its prey. Margaret was sitting at the front desk this time, her face pale and her eyes even more tired than before, as if the daylight brought her no peace. When I greeted her, she said nothing for a moment and simply stared at me with an expression that I couldn't quite decipher, somewhere between sympathy and silent warning. Then, in a flat voice with no inflection, she finally said, "They noticed you." Before I could ask what she meant, she stood, handed me the keys and flashlight, and walked out the front doors into the cold dark, not even waiting for a response. From the moment the lobby clock struck midnight, the building changed again. I had started my window checks early, having learned from the night before that Rule 2 wasn't to be trifled with. Most of them closed easily, as expected, but when I entered room 108, a small unit usually occupied by a resident named Mr. Fairchild, I found the window wide open and the room unusually cold. I tried to close it gently, but the latch wouldn't catch, and then, just as I remembered the rule and began backing out, Mr. Fairchild sat up in his bed with a sudden jerk, his eyes wide open and unfocused. I froze, watching him as he turned his head slowly toward me, his lips twitching into what I can only describe as a grotesque half-smile. "Are you cold too?" he asked in a voice that was unmistakably his, but something in the tone sounded stretched, like someone imitating him through cracked glass. "I'm just finishing my rounds, Mr. Fairchild," I said carefully, not stepping any closer, already gripping the doorknob behind me. His head tilted slowly, that same unnatural grin stuck to his face. "You're not supposed to be here right now." I didn't answer. I didn't even nod. I just stepped back out, closed the door, and walked quickly away down the hallway, not daring to look back. The silence returned, but not comfortably. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath, and I was intruding on something ancient and resentful. An hour later, around 1 a.m., I was patrolling the West Wing. It was mostly dark except for a dim red exit sign that painted the hallway in a sickly glow. When I heard it again, my name, soft and pleading, echoing faintly from the darkness beyond room 122. At first, it sounded like my sister, then my mother, and then the voice I hadn't heard in years, my grandfather who had died when I was 15. "Danny, come here," it whispered again, the cadence perfect, the emotion too real. I bit the inside of my cheek hard, so hard I tasted blood, just to anchor myself in the pain and force my feet to keep moving. Rule 1. Never acknowledge the whispers. And yet, they followed. As I turned the corner toward the nurse's station, the voices didn't fade, they multiplied, now whispering from both ends of the hallway, overlapping in an eerie, discordant chorus that felt like it was crawling under my skin. I stuffed my hands into my pockets and recited the rules over and over in my head like a mantra, as if repeating them would protect me. When the whispers finally faded, I was standing outside room 217. I didn't plan to go in. I hadn't even intended to walk near it, but somehow that's where I ended up, like my feet had been led there by something unseen. The door was closed, the light from underneath flickered. I turned to walk away, but stopped. From inside came the unmistakable creak of floorboards, followed by the soft sound of humming. A woman's voice. Old, fragile, humming a tune I didn't recognize. And then, laughter. Childlike. High-pitched, and yet off. The sound of it made my skin prickle and my stomach twist. I didn't open the door. I didn't move. I just stood there, heart hammering in my chest, until the light under the door dimmed to nothing, and the silence returned like a lid being screwed back onto a jar. I didn't even have a chance to process it before I heard the sound I dreaded most, the tinkling music of a music box playing Twinkle Twinkle, Little Star. The sound drifted through the halls faintly, echoing as if bouncing off invisible walls. I followed it, step by cautious step, until I reached the recreational lounge. There, in the center of the room, the same music box sat on the floor, its lid open and spinning slowly, though no hand had touched it. Remembering Rule 6, I knelt, wound it once, and stood back as the melody played in full. But this time, when it finished, I heard another sound from the hallway outside, a low groan like wood straining under pressure, then a dragging sound, and then footsteps, deliberate, heavy, coming closer. I shut the lid and backed against the far wall. The footsteps paused just outside the door, and for several minutes nothing moved. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I felt as though if I made even the faintest sound, something unspeakable would enter that room. Then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, the presence moved away, fading down the hallway like smoke dispersing into the wind. When the clock struck 5, I made my way back to the lobby, every instinct in my body screaming at me to flee instead. But Rule 7 was the final one, the one that kept me grounded, and I knew I had to obey it no matter what. I sat down in the armchair facing the front door, and again the cold settled around me, thicker than the night before, as though the building itself had grown more aware of me. The silence became violent in its intensity. Behind me, something began to whisper, not words this time, but hisses, clicks, the scuttling of tiny feet on tile. Then I heard breathing, raspy, wet, uneven. It came so close I could almost feel the moisture of it brush the side of my face. Still, I didn't move. Not even when something touched my shoulder with a hand that was ice cold and impossibly long-fingered. I stared at the front doors and waited for the light, my body paralyzed, my mind a mess of spiraling terror and disbelief. And when the sun finally crept over the horizon, bleeding gold into the lobby, the pressure snapped away again and I felt the invisible weight vanish, leaving only the ache of survival behind. This time, Margaret didn't greet me. In fact, no one did. I stood in the lobby alone, gripping the flashlight, and realized this building had begun to notice me in ways that were growing more personal. I wasn't just a guest anymore, I had become part of it. There was an unbearable stillness in that moment. Something about the light slanting through the lobby windows felt wrong, artificial, like the sun had only risen because I had completed my part of the ritual, and not because it was supposed to. The quiet was not peaceful, it was smothering, like the breathless pause after a scream. No footsteps echoed from the hallways. No buzz of activity hummed from the kitchen. No one, not even Margaret, was there to relieve me. I called out her name once quietly, as though even speaking too loudly might trigger something best left asleep. No response came. Only the hum of the fluorescent lights above, flickering slightly as if they too were weary from what had transpired. I should have left right then, walked out the front door, driven away, and never returned. But something in my body, in my bones, insisted otherwise. I couldn't explain it. Like a hand pressed against the base of my spine, gently but firmly guiding me back inside, whispering without words that leaving was no longer a choice I had the luxury of making. I didn't even notice my feet moving until I was already halfway down the east wing, past the nurse's break room, and into territory that felt different. It wasn't just the silence. It was the air itself, heavier, denser, almost humid, and filled with a faint, sour scent that reminded me of meat left too long in the sun. My goal had been simple, to find Margaret, to tell her something had changed, that the building had crossed a line. But instead, I found room 110. The door was slightly ajar. This room hadn't been assigned to any of the residents as far as I knew. It was always marked maintenance, though no one I'd ever met had mentioned seeing anyone go in or out of it. The hallway around it was darker than the others, as though the overhead lights had dimmed deliberately just outside its reach. I should have kept walking, I knew that instinctively, but something was leaking out of the room. A sound. Wet. Repetitive. Like someone chewing. Slowly. I pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. The room was empty, or at least it appeared to be at first. Then I saw it. In the far corner, crouched beside a metal utility sink, was something, humanoid in shape, but horribly wrong in every other sense. Its limbs were too long, too thin, the skin stretched tight and glossy like wet parchment over bone. It was hunched over something on the floor, something that I slowly realized was a human arm, gnawed and mangled at the elbow. The creature stopped chewing, head tilting up slowly. I didn't wait for it to turn around. I shut the door and walked away. I didn't run. I couldn't afford to. When I returned to the main hallway, Margaret was finally there, but something was wrong. She stood at the far end of the corridor, too still, too stiff, facing me with a posture that made my stomach twist. Her hands were at her sides, fingers curled inward, and her head cocked slightly, as though straining to hear a distant sound. I approached cautiously. "Margaret?" I said. She didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't move. I remembered Rule 4. If you find a resident standing motionless in the hallway, do not approach them, announce your presence, and wait. If they do not respond, retreat slowly and avoid eye contact. Margaret wasn't a resident, but right now she looked like one. "I'm here," I said softly. "It's me, Daniel." No response, just the faint twitch of her left hand. I began to step back, one foot behind the other. Careful, measured. That's when her mouth opened, not in a scream, not in a word, just opened, wider than it should have, far too wide. The sound that emerged wasn't language. It was the same hissing, clicking nonsense I had heard behind me in the lobby chair, the same wet breathing. And then, all at once, her body convulsed, like a puppet cut from its strings, collapsing onto the linoleum in a heap of limbs that didn't seem to belong together. I didn't stop to see if she'd get back up. I rushed to the office, locked the door behind me, and collapsed into the desk chair, my lungs burning as I fought the urge to scream. I flipped on the monitors. Each hallway camera feed was flickering now, like static trying to resolve a shape just beyond the frame. In several of the rooms, residents who were supposed to be asleep stood at the foot of their beds, unmoving, faces turned directly toward the cameras. Their mouths were open, each and every one of them. I turned off the feed. I stayed in that office until the following night. No one came to relieve me. No one called. The phones didn't ring. At exactly midnight, I performed the window checks. Every single one was already locked. Every single one. And yet, I felt the cold in every room, an unnatural chill that clung to the baseboards and seeped through the walls. In room 202, the curtains billowed despite the closed glass. In room 105, the window was fogged from the inside, and when I wiped it with my sleeve, I found small fingerprints on the other side. Too small to belong to any of our residents. At 1 a.m., I heard the whispers again. This time they were louder, angrier. They called my name in chorus, layered voices, childlike, feminine, guttural, hollow. Some said it like a plea, others like a threat. But I remembered Rule 1. I ignored them. I moved faster now, making sure each hallway light remained on. Somewhere between 2:30 and 3 a.m., the elevator dinged. It had not been called. The doors opened, revealing nothing but a darkened interior. My body wanted to look, to confirm that it was empty, but Rule 5 stopped me. I turned my back and walked away without hesitation, even as the sound of something stepping out echoed behind me. I kept moving, never turned around. At 3:47 a.m., I heard the music box again. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, drifting softly through the walls like a lullaby woven through broken glass. I followed it. The sound led me to room 203. Inside, the music box sat on the nightstand, turning slowly on its own. I wound it once, just once. The music played cleanly, fully. When it finished, the room grew still, except for the closet door, which opened on its own. Inside was only darkness, deep, choking, almost alive. I left the room and didn't look back. By 4:55 a.m., I was already in the lobby. I sat in the armchair facing the front doors, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear, clutching the flashlight like it was a crucifix. At exactly 5 a.m., I felt the presence return. It didn't whisper this time, it walked. I heard its bare feet slapping wetly on the tile behind me. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. It circled me once, then again, and on the third time it stopped directly behind the chair. A breath, cold and foul, washed over the crown of my head. My knuckles turned white from gripping the arms of the chair so tightly. It stayed there until the first glimmer of dawn peeked through the glass, and then it left. The light returned. But this time, it didn't feel like I had survived. It felt like I had been claimed. Whatever it was that circled me that morning, whatever intelligence or force had dragged its invisible limbs across the tiles behind me, had not come just to scare me. It had come to mark something, to finalize some unseen agreement I had never consented to. The moment the golden thread of sunrise spilled across the cracked lobby floor, the sense of dread didn't lift as it had before. Instead, it deepened, settling into my skin like a rot I couldn't wash out, an infection I could feel festering under the surface of my thoughts. That morning, I didn't rise from the armchair until the sun was fully above the tree line, until the shadows in the lobby had receded into the corners where even the light dared not linger. And when I finally did stand, it felt like peeling myself away from something that had fused to me in the dark. There was no Margaret, no residents, no staff. The facility was, again, disturbingly empty, except for the low, mechanical hum of the building itself, as though it had begun breathing on its own, each groaning pipe a lung pulling in the staleness of night and exhaling something colder, older. I made my way down the west corridor, unsure of what I was even looking for anymore. Answers, maybe, or at the very least, a sign that someone else had survived the night with me. The east hallway was no better. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder than usual, flickering like they were struggling to stay awake, and the wallpaper seemed more bubbled and curled at the corners than the day before, as if the building's very flesh was decaying around me. I passed room 110, its door now closed but stained around the handle with something dark and viscous, already half-dried. I didn't dare check if it was locked. I didn't want to know. Instead, I returned to the office, thinking maybe I could call someone, maybe corporate, maybe the police, maybe even a damn priest, but the phone lines were still dead, and now the monitors refused to show anything at all. Each screen was static, not black, not gray, static, white and angry, hissing softly like the whispers I had spent 2 nights trying to ignore. I leaned in to adjust one of the cameras manually, hoping maybe the wiring had just come loose. But the moment my fingers touched the back of the screen, the static cut to black and a single frame flickered into view. It was the lobby, the chair. I was still sitting in it. I staggered backward so fast I nearly tripped over the desk chair. But when I bolted to the lobby, the real one, it was empty. The chair sat as it had always been, plain, old, quiet. But I felt a chill crawl across my scalp because for one sickening moment, I wasn't entirely sure I hadn't left something of myself behind in that seat. I didn't know what was real anymore. The rules had blurred. The nights were bleeding into the days. And then, at 11:46 p.m. that evening, something happened that hadn't happened in either of the two previous nights. The intercom crackled. No one had used it in months. I didn't even think it worked. But suddenly, out of the thin, reedy speaker in the hallway, a woman's voice began to hum. Low, melodic, almost motherly. It was Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Only slower and not quite right. The melody fell flat in places. The timing stuttered unnaturally, as though someone or something was struggling to remember how the song went. My heart slammed against my ribs. Rule 6. I didn't wait. I bolted down the corridor, tracing the sound like a bloodhound, desperate to stop whatever would happen if that song didn't end properly. I passed several resident doors, 203, 209, 212, and the music grew louder with each step, its warped tune echoing against the walls like a lullaby dragged from a dream into a nightmare. Then I saw it. Room 217. I froze. Not because of the room number. At first, I didn't even realize what room I had stopped in front of, but because of the sound. The music box was inside, and it was still playing. I knew what the rule said about 217. I had avoided it. Everyone had. But the music was in there now, and if I didn't wind it, if I didn't finish the tune, then it would keep playing, and it would bring something with it. So I made a choice. I entered. I kept my eyes on the floor, refusing to glance at anything reflective, especially the far wall where I knew that cursed mirror hung. The air was suffocating in the room, thick with something like mildew and copper. And there it was, the music box, sitting on the dresser, its little ballerina twirling slowly but clearly beginning to wind down, the melody faltering note by note. I reached out. I turned it once. The ballerina began to spin again. This time smoother, the tune clearer, purer. I waited until it finished. Then I backed away. But I heard breathing. Not from behind me, not from the hallway, from inside the room. No, from the mirror. I didn't look. I didn't need to. The reflection wasn't mine. I knew that. I felt that. The breath was too deep, too heavy, too close. I could hear the saliva in its throat, could feel the heat of its presence on my neck. And just as I reached the door, a voice, my voice, spoke from inside the room. You wound it too late. I ran. Out of the room, down the hallway. I didn't stop until I was back in the main corridor, collapsing against the wall, my lungs heaving and my mind unraveling. How had my voice spoken from inside that room? What did it mean? And then the lights went out. Not just one, all of them. A complete blackout. The silence that followed was total. No humming, no whispering, not even the faint buzz of the power grid. Then the elevator dinged. My chest seized. Rule 5. The elevator arrived on the ground floor at 3:02 a.m. No one had called it. I was alone in the dark, staring at the pale red numbers glowing above the elevator doors like a wound that refused to scab. I knew what the rule said. Do not look inside. But as the doors slid open, I couldn't stop myself. I turned. Inside there was no one, but the floor was wet, and in the center of the elevator was a single item, my flashlight, the one I had been carrying. Only I was still holding mine. I stared down at the one in my hand, back up at the one in the elevator. My knees buckled slightly. I backed away, nearly slipping on the smooth tile. Then a hand shot out of the elevator, pale, thin, wet. It slammed into the hallway floor, pulling the rest of its grotesque form out after it, a crawling, skinless shape that moved with jerking, animalistic spasms. It wore my uniform. It had my face. And as it looked at me, it smiled, a smile that stretched impossibly wide, tearing the skin at the edges. It whispered my name. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going anymore. The hallways were endless, repeating like loops in a corrupted cassette tape. I passed room 202 3 times, even though I never turned back. The windows were no longer just fogged. They were cracked, and behind each one stood a face. Not residents, not staff, something else, watching. At 4:57 a.m., I collapsed in the lobby again, bleeding, shaking, crying. I crawled to the armchair. I sat down and waited. At 5 a.m., the sound of footsteps returned. This time they didn't circle me. They walked directly in front of me, pacing slowly across the lobby like something inspecting its new possession. The presence didn't breathe this time. It didn't whisper. It simply existed so completely, so thickly, that the air in the room bent around it. Then it spoke. Margaret's voice. "Welcome home, Daniel." The sun rose, and I could not move. It was not the warmth of the morning light that held me there, paralyzed in the armchair, but rather the weight of something far colder, something ancient and deliberate, that had latched onto my chest like a second skin, suffocating and possessive, its invisible claws threading into my spine. Margaret's voice still echoed in my skull long after the air had quieted, and even though the sun now spilled across the lobby floor in golden lines, the room remained dim in a way that sunlight could not fix, as though the shadows had simply learned how to exist in daylight too. My limbs refused to obey me, but it wasn't paralysis in the traditional sense. It felt more like I was being held down, not by gravity, but by the will of whatever had spoken through Margaret's voice. My heart pounded not from exhaustion, but from the realization that, after 3 nights of horror, I had somehow crossed an invisible threshold. I wasn't just surviving the rules anymore, I was becoming part of them. I was no longer a visitor in this place. I had been claimed, and the thing that now walked these halls knew my name. It had said it aloud. It had acknowledged me. At 5:11 a.m., my body finally responded. The weight lifted, not completely, but enough to allow me to sit forward, gasping for air like I'd been drowning beneath the surface of something unseen. I wanted to leave. I needed to. My legs trembled as I stood, and each step across the lobby floor felt like it was being judged by unseen eyes embedded in the very walls. As I moved toward the exit, my hand brushed the cold metal of the front doors, and I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare had reached its conclusion. But the doors did not open. The electronic lock blinked red, something it had never done before. And then the lobby lights flickered 3 times, slowly, deliberately, almost as if to answer my unspoken thought. I wasn't getting out. Not yet. Maybe not ever. A soft buzzing began to fill the room, and I turned to see every hallway monitor flicker back to life. One by one, they displayed black and white footage of the building's corridors, but they weren't live feeds. These were recordings, grainy, time-stamped, and jumping erratically between scenes. I saw myself from the night before, sprinting past room 202. Then again, curled in the fetal position near the East Wing restroom. Then I saw a clip from 2 nights ago, the nurse's station empty, but something moved across the bottom of the screen. A blur, a shape. It paused, turned, and looked directly at the camera. No features, just darkness. But it stared, long enough that I felt it staring at me now, as though its awareness wasn't bound by the screen. Suddenly, the monitors all went black, except one. The feed switched to room 108. Inside stood Margaret, but not as I remembered her. Her head hung slightly askew, like her neck could no longer support the weight of her skull, and her arms dangled lifelessly at her sides. Her face was pale, drained of any expression, and yet her lips twitched in slow, spasmodic movements, like she was trying to speak but couldn't form words anymore. As I stared in horror, her eyes snapped upward to the camera, and without sound, her mouth stretched open into a silent scream. Then the feed cut, and the overhead speaker crackled to life. This time, it was not Margaret's voice, it was mine. "Daniel," it whispered, my tone, my inflection, but hollowed out, gutted of anything human. "Why are you still running?" I staggered back, heart slamming against my ribs like it was trying to escape the prison of my chest. I didn't answer. I remembered Rule 1, never acknowledge the whispers, no matter how familiar they sounded. I turned, trying to flee the lobby, but every hallway now looked the same. The wallpaper had peeled further. The walls pulsed slightly as if breathing, and the floor tiles were wet beneath my shoes, slick with something thick and black. Room numbers were gone. There were no doors anymore. Just endless hallways stretching forward and backward, lit by ceiling bulbs that buzzed and hummed in uneven rhythm. As I walked deeper into the corridor, I realized I was no longer alone. A figure appeared at the far end, motionless. I couldn't make out its features, but I remembered Rule 4. If you find a resident standing motionless in the hallway, do not approach them. Announce your presence. Wait. My voice cracked as I called out, "Hello? Can you hear me?" The figure did not move. I waited. Seconds passed, then a full minute. Still no response. I stepped backward slowly, avoiding eye contact, and the figure remained still until I turned the corner. Then I heard it move, not walking, scraping like bare heels dragging across tile. I broke into a run, not looking back, heart thundering louder than my footsteps. Then, music. That tune. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Slower, warbled like it was being played through water. My stomach twisted. Rule 6. Win the music box once and let it finish the tune. The melody drifted down from somewhere ahead, distant but getting closer. I followed it, no longer trying to think, just obeying, because every time I didn't obey the rules, something worse happened. I followed the melody through the winding corridors until I reached a maintenance closet, barely cracked open, the tune leaking out from the darkness within. I hesitated. My fingers trembled as I pushed the door open wider, revealing the music box perched on a stack of towels, its ballerina twisted awkwardly sideways mid-turn, frozen as the tune slowed to a dying crawl. I wound it once. The ballerina jolted into motion and spun as the melody played properly this time. Clear, complete, as if the box itself sighed in relief. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. I was locked in. And then I heard breathing. It came from beneath the floor. Wet, rasping, heaving breathing. The drain in the corner gurgled and shuddered as something pushed against it from below, the metal grating bulging upward like a blister on the skin of the world. I backed into the shelves, knocking over a box of gloves, and crouched as the breathing grew louder, closer, until a single hand, gray, boneless, oozing, forced its way through the grate. But then the melody ended, and everything went still. The hand retracted, the breathing stopped, the door creaked open on its own. I ran. No destination, no direction, just away from the closet, from the hallway, from the knowledge that the rules were the only thing keeping me alive. I knew what I had to do. Only one rule remained. Rule 7. At 5 a.m., go to the main lobby and sit in the armchair facing the front door. Do not move until the sun rises. No matter what you see or hear, remain seated and do not respond to any stimuli. That was the only rule I had not broken, and maybe that was why I was still alive. But something else waited for me. Back in the lobby, the armchair was not empty. It was me, already seated, eyes blank, staring at the door. And standing beside me, beside him, was Margaret. Smiling now, not kindly, but hungrily. She looked up as I entered, her head tilting unnaturally sideways, and her voice was no longer just hers. It was mine. And something else. Dozens of voices layered together, whispering in unison. "We told you, welcome home." I stepped backward, but the door behind me was gone. Only wall. Only this place. Only the rules. And the thing in the chair smiled up at me with my face and patted the cushion beside him. The sun was rising, and I had nowhere left to run. And as the first pale ray of dawn bled through the filmy lobby windows, it illuminated a scene that should not have been possible. My own motionless body seated in the armchair where I was supposed to be, where the rules had told me to be, where I had planned to be. Yet now, that version of me, his skin waxen, his pupils dilated and staring straight ahead without a flicker of awareness, sat slouched slightly forward as though he'd been waiting a long, long time. Margaret, or the thing wearing her like an old, stretched-out skin suit, hovered behind him with unnatural stillness, her arms limp but not lifeless, her grin too wide, too deep, too knowing. The fluorescent lights above us buzzed softly, flickering like tired eyes, and the silence in the room had become unbearably thick, coiling around me like smoke from a fire that burned in a place just outside of time. I didn't know whether to approach or run, but the absence of any exits made the choice irrelevant. The doorway I had entered from had vanished, replaced by seamless, pulsing wall, as if the building itself had finally decided to seal me in like a tomb. The air smelled different now, too. Thicker, soured with iron and rot, as though the sun's presence had failed to cleanse what had taken root here. And though Margaret hadn't moved since I'd entered, I could feel her watching me from beneath her lashes, eyes glassy and wet like something freshly dead, and yet aware. Beneath her smile, I could hear a sound, barely perceptible, a dry clicking like teeth grinding against each other, or bone rubbing on bone. "Why are you standing?" Margaret asked in my voice, my exact voice. Except there was something else behind it now, as if the voice box that produced it was layered with other throats, other mouths, all trying to speak at once through the filter of my identity. Her head gave a small jerk, twitching ever so slightly to the left, like a puppet reacting to slack strings. "Your seat's been warmed for you." The seated version of me didn't move. He hadn't blinked once. But now I could see his chest rising and falling very subtly, like he was breathing slower than life allowed, as if every breath was being carefully rationed. A cold wave of nausea passed over me when I noticed the thin black liquid trickling from the corners of his mouth, disappearing into the collar of his shirt, soaking into the cushion beneath him like a quiet infection. I wasn't alive. Not entirely. Not anymore. I wanted to scream, to confront her, to demand what this place was, what the rules had been preparing me for, but all I managed was a dry whisper. "What is this?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she floated closer, her feet dragging soundlessly over the tile. With each step, the walls around us pulsed brighter, as if reacting to her presence or to mine. She leaned in, close enough for me to see the threads in her skin, the kind of texture you'd find in a papier-mâché mask left too long in the rain. Her voice was calm, almost maternal, and worse for it. "This is what happens when you obey too late, Daniel," she said, reaching one hand to stroke the arm of the chair where my doppelganger sat. "The rules were not written for survival. They were written to choose, to filter, to prepare what comes next." I backed away, heart racing, only to feel the floor ripple beneath me like liquid pretending to be solid. The building itself seemed to breathe now, the sound echoing from the vents in long, rattling sighs, like the end of something old exhaling its last before the new could begin. The armchair groaned suddenly, wood creaking like it was straining to support something heavier than it appeared, and my seated double blinked, once, then turned his head toward me. When our eyes met, I felt something inside me give. Snap, maybe. Because those eyes weren't just mine. They were filled with something else, some endless depth of sorrow and hunger and cold understanding. He opened his mouth, and though his lips barely moved, his voice entered my head clearly. "I did everything right," he said, "and still, I was not enough." Margaret laughed softly behind him, an ancient, hollow sound that carried the weight of centuries. "You followed the rules, Daniel, but you were never the one being tested." I looked around the room, now warping in real time, the wallpaper curling in on itself like burning parchment, the paintings on the wall shifting violently, their frames rattling as if the things depicted within them were trying to escape. The grandfather clock in the corner had stopped ticking, its hands spinning backward, faster and faster until the glass face cracked inwards. Time, it seemed, was ending here, or looping, or falling apart altogether. "Then who was being tested?" I asked, my voice ragged. Margaret's form twitched once more, her neck snapping to an impossible angle. "You misunderstand," she hissed, her voice no longer human. "This place doesn't test the living, it harvests what the rules reveal." Suddenly, the lights blinked out. For a full second, I stood in perfect darkness, and in that darkness, I heard them. All the voices from the whispers, from the music box, from the elevator, from the residents who never responded. They chanted my name in a tone that was neither mocking nor worshipful, but analytical, studying, weighing. When the lights returned, I wasn't alone. The lobby was full. Hundreds of figures now stood silently in the space, packed shoulder to shoulder, wall to wall. None of them breathed. None of them moved. Some wore hospital gowns. Others still wore the uniforms of former staff. Many bore no faces at all, just smooth skin stretched where features should have been. And in the center, standing directly across from me, was a woman holding a clipboard. She was dressed like a nurse, but her eyes were not kind, not tired, not weary from overwork. They were pitiless and sharp like blades, and her mouth was fixed in a line too straight to be natural. She raised her pen and spoke, her voice flat, emotionless, like someone reciting a list. "Daniel Carter, voluntary subject, rule sequence 213654, partial completion of rule 7. Verdict, transition pending." I stumbled backward. "Transition? Transition into what?" She didn't reply. Instead, the crowd began to breathe. Not through lungs, but as one singular, massive, interconnected organism. The ceiling above us opened slowly, revealing not sky, but an endless spiraling void of tendrils and lights that pulsed in time with the crowd's breath. My double stood now, the black liquid pouring from his mouth, his eyes locked on mine with such intensity that I couldn't look away. Margaret approached, placing one hand gently on my shoulder. "You followed the rules," she whispered, "and now you must become them." Before I could move, before I could fight, the tendrils from the void above descended, slow, deliberate, impossibly cold, and pierced the space around me, threading into my skin without breaking it. I screamed, not from pain, but from the memory that was suddenly injected into my head. Not mine, someone else's. Hundreds of lives, thousands, all the ones who had come before me. All the ones who had broken the rules, and all the ones who had obeyed them too late. Their terror became mine. Their endings became my beginning. And as I was lifted off the floor by invisible threads, my body suspended between dimensions, the lobby below me flickered like a faulty transmission, my final view of the place where the rules had once seemed so simple. The clipboard nurse stared up at me, her expression unchanged. Margaret smiled with what was left of her real face, and I heard my own voice, no longer mine, reciting, "Rule 1, never acknowledge the whispers." It was happening again, not to me, but through me, because now I was the rules. I was the voice in the hallway. I was the figure beside the armchair. I was the echo behind the music box, the breath beneath the drain, the silence in the elevator shaft. And tomorrow, when someone new arrived, I would be waiting.